I'm here tonight, of course, to speak to Bill C-62 and about the self-inflicted debacle that has been unfolding in Parliament since Parliament passed its radical expansion of legal medical assistance in dying to include persons for whom the sole underlying health condition is mental illness. And I'll remind members of the House and my constituents that I did support and still support the principles of the 2016 bill, which was a necessary response to a 2015 Supreme Court ruling that had struck down the blanket prohibition against MAID. That bill wasn't perfect, but it was a reasonable response to the Supreme Court's decision, and it was certainly better than the free-for-all on MAID that would have surely followed had there been no law. It is my view that people who are intolerably suffering from a terminal disease without any hope of recovery or any prospect for improvement and are spiraling into a certain death as a result of illness or disease, that they ought to be able to seek medical assistance in dying as long as they are not coerced, as long as they have received an option of proper palliative care, as long as they are not proactively offered MAID as an alternative to treatment, and most importantly, as long as the patient is a mentally competent adult. And part of the criteria laid out in the original 2016 law was the reasonable foreseeability of death of the applicant. This clause was a problem from the start, and it was challenged in court and struck down by the Quebec Superior Court. The Truchon case presented the Liberals with a decision point. At that point, the decisions this government has made since then have all been wrong. The first thing that they could have done but did not was to actually defend their own existing law and appeal the Truchon decision to the Supreme Court. If the Liberals believed that their 2016 law was charter compliant, like they claimed it was during debate in 2016, they should have stepped up and defended it. Not doing so was the first mistake. The second mistake was that the Minister of Justice, who was then Minister of Justice, was so eager to expand the law. They used the Truchon case as an opportunity to open up and expand access to medical assistance in dying and tabled C7 in the fall of 2020. That was their second mistake. And as I've said before, Madam Speaker, I do support MAID for competent adults who are grievously and irremediably ill and suffering cruelly from intolerable pain and anguish in the late stages of a terminal illness. And I've consistently said that there are important conditions for my support for legal access to MAID. One, the availability of quality palliative care as an option. Two, the existence of robust safeguards for the vulnerable, especially minors, the disabled, and the mentally ill. Conscience protection for practitioners who oppose MAID, and that any expansion of the availability of eligibility for MAID be well thought out, carefully considered, and not rushed. For these reasons, I voted to send Bill C7 to committee, but I voted against it at third reading because it failed on at least two, maybe three of my four conditions for support. And I concluded that their eligibility, access to palliative care is not adequate in Canada. I've also become alarmed by the cracks in what should be the protections for vulnerable Canadians as we've experienced, actually, Madam Speaker, in my own family. And so it was my view, even before the Senate amendment, that Bill C7 was flawed and unworthy of support. But then this House made a terrible decision when it passed the amendment that came back from the Senate, Madam Speaker. It was rightly opposed by all of my Conservative colleagues who knew then that, and knew that medical professionals cannot, with the certainty required for what is literally a life and death decision, to determine irremediability of a patient in a case of mental illness. Conservatives opposed it, but it was passed nevertheless, and this expansion, which was not necessary to conform to any court decision, was to come into effect last year. The government had to introduce emergency legislation this time last year to give the medical system more time for this extraordinary change. That was the next mistake that they made. They could have used that opportunity to deal with this once and for all and simply strike this portion of what was then C7. But they didn't do it, and here we are another year later. And Madam Speaker, this country is no more ready for this expansion than they were this time last year. And here we are again in an 11th hour panic to kick this further down the road until after the next election. The next mistake. They could now, or they could have tabled a bill that would have removed this from the bill that passed in 2021, but they've chosen not to. So they have said the next government will have to deal with this. But the good news, Madam Speaker, is that the Conservative government, which will surely be formed after the next election, will not recklessly expand the application of MAID to include vulnerable Canadians whose sole underlying health condition is a mental illness. Madam Speaker, MAID is for people who cannot get better. It is for people who have no reason to hope that they can get better because they are in an irreversible terminal state. It's for people capable of making a rational decision and not as a means of potentially fulfilling suicide ideation. While the impossibility of creating a regime that could determine appropriate MAID from the mentally ill, but otherwise healthy people who are not in the final stages of a terminal illness, that seemed intuitive to me, but of course I'm not a medical professional. But I can also, though, point to the clear message that was sent from the committee, the joint committee that studied this, and their recommendation to Parliament was very simple. Don't do it. It was the shortest list of recommendations I've ever read in a parliamentary report, Madam Speaker. It just said, don't do it. That was the recommendation based on months and months and months of testimony from experts. So that would have been my recommendation to this government. Listen to the committee and strike it from the bill that passed. So this time last year, they could have done that, but they kicked it ahead till this year. Nothing has changed. So we find ourselves here where a full 80% of Ontario Psychiatric Association, 80% of Ontario members of the Ontario Psychiatric Association do not believe that Canada can safely implement MAID for mental illness. So, but here we are, we're just pushing this back a couple of years. Now, I don't have a lot of time left, but I want to share with this House the words of one of my constituents who met with me in November. She said in a letter to me that I got before I met her, 23 years ago, this is her words, 23 years ago, age 19, I made the desperate decision to try and escape what appeared to me to be a dark world. While taking a course in pharmacology, I calculated the quantity of poison needed to arrest the heart of an adult male, multiplied it by 3, chose to ingest it. I felt compassion for the suffering of others and the weight of constant terrible news. Though I formerly had the capacity to deal with this, the ingestion of a single pill coerced upon me by a well-intending physician inadvertently plummeted my thoughts into despair. So, Madam Speaker, what she told me later was that the side effect of a medication that she had been prescribed caused her to immediately become suicidal, and that her survival was described as miraculous by the professionals that attended her. She is now a wife, a mother, lives a productive, meaningful life. She's convinced that had MAID been available to her earlier in her life, she would have sought it and potentially have been granted. She told me that the sufferings earlier in her life may well have been thought to be irremediable and thus made her eligible. So this government has failed to defend their original law. They failed to focus the new law on the narrow constraints of the Truchon decision. They used the Truchon decision in Quebec as an excuse for a reckless expansion of MAID. When it was obvious that they'd made a mistake, they dithered instead of acting decisively, and they're dithering now by pushing this down 2 more years down the road. That's not leadership. This is just bizarre enthusiasm for the most radical expansion of MAID possible, which is now run amok. So I do support swift passage of this bill. Given the extensive debate that has already taken place, I was prepared to let it pass unanimously, but here we are. I had an opportunity to get some of my thoughts on the record. I see them out of time, so I'll be happy to take questions.
Séance des commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Yes, Madam Speaker. I was actually encouraged at the end. The member indicated that he supports the swift passage the legislation and ultimately the motion. I take it that's because he realizes the consequence of the House not having that passage before a deadline. And I'm wondering if he could give an indication on whether or not, is that his personal opinion or is that the Conservative Party's position?
For Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, Madam Speaker, Conservatives know that we cannot allow this bill to fail and thus stumble into a wild, unprepared territory where made for those that have a sole underlying health condition and mental illness are permitted to access MAID when it is so clear that the country is not ready for it.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Montcalm.
The honourable member from Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, my colleague claims that C-14 was a good piece of legislation with its reasonably foreseeable criterion. But that doesn't even meet the requirements of the Carter decision, even though Ms. Carter didn't even have a terminal illness. And the Supreme Court still said that the legislation should cover situations like Ms. Carter and Ms. Taylor. So to say that it can be restricted to the terminal phase of life is to leave out all those people like Ms. Gladue and Ms. Truchon who had to go to court to fight for their constitutional rights. And people have had to go on hunger strikes to meet the criterion of reasonably foreseeable natural death. Is that the only indicator of compassion he has? The honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Understood me. What I said in my speech was that that I voted for C-14 because it was a reasonable response to that had to be to something that had to be addressed, which was the Carter decision. The reasonable foreseeability of death was a problem clause, and I thought so at the time. I thought it was an awkward and not, perhaps not the best way to put it, so it wasn't a shock to me that it may have been that it ended up being challenged on that basis. So I think he may have been overestimating my enthusiasm for C-14, but I did support it. It had something that had to be done, but this reckless expansion that came upon after the Senate amendments to C7 goes way beyond no court was calling upon Parliament or forcing Parliament to expand the eligibility of MAID to those for whom their sole underlying health condition is mental illness.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, the New Democrats actually also did vote against that, what I thought was an ill-advised Senate amendment to Bill C7. And, you know, there's plenty of blame to be thrown around. I understand that. I've done more than my fair share this week against the Liberals. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Speaker, is we are at a moment right now where time is critical. We have about a week and a half left in terms of sitting weeks until the March 17th deadline. So it is imperative that this bill gets passed through the House this week so that it can go to the Senate. I'm glad to hear the members' support for that measure, but I'm curious as to why, when we had a vote on time management of this motion, which is programming the bill, why did the Conservatives vote against that, when knowing that could have actually jeopardized the time that we had available to us this week to get C-62 passed?
Honourable member for Calgary Rocky Ridge has 1 minute to respond.
There's no danger of C-62 not passing this House, and I think there's been perhaps some failure of the combined party leadership negotiations to come up with an arrangement that would have expedited this. You know, I'm not concerned about this bill not passing. The programming motion is there. Our party I certainly never had any intention to deliberately delay this passage of this bill, and that is not what any Conservative has attempted to do and is not attempting to do.